Last week, we spoke to research fellow at the Botswana Institute for Development Policy Analysis, BIDPA, Professor Roman Grinberg, about whether the malls we see sprouting across our cities are sustainable, whether they truly represent that Botswana have the increased disposable income to indulge in such levels of consumerism.
We've been doing a great deal of research on import patterns here in Botswana. There's a lot more expenditure on clothing, obviously on food and restaurants, but wages in the public sector, as you're probably aware, haven't been rising, and that's been over a period of 5 years. Private and personal debt appears to be rising rapidly. So perhaps what is happening is that a lot of the spending is debt financed.
This week, we sit down with economists, as promised, to get an expert analysis of how big a problem this culture of debt is nationally, and what kind of thinking is causing what some observers say is the reckless spending of money people simply do not have. Welcome to the show. In her book, The Overspent American, author Juliet Shaw says that for many Americans, being solidly middle class is no longer good enough. She says even though people find their paycheck increasingly overcommitted, oddly, it does not seem as if they are spending wastefully or even lavishly. Rather, many feel that they are just making it, barely able to stay even. This, we think, speaks to the fact that a good number of people seem to have blurred the line between which goods and services are necessities and which are wants. The US had a household debt to GDP ratio as high as 130% in late 2007. The following year, the financial crisis hit the country, caused by the burst in the housing bubble. As at the first quarter last year, the ratio, according to a report, is down to 78%. In Botswana, as at January this year, total household debt stood at 24 billion pula, or 20% of GDP, a significant increase for us from 12% of GDP just a few years ago. While our household debt to GDP ratio is not as bad as the previous example, what is of concern in Botswana is that the bulk of borrowing is short-term and not for longer-term mortgages and the like. Botswana consumers' irresponsible borrowing and love for luxuries despite their economic realities could therefore have wide-scale repercussions. That person with an entry-level job but an expensive lifestyle, the intern with a penchant for designer clothing, the money has to be accounted for at some point. We have invited this evening financial analyst and deputy CEO at the Botswana Stock Exchange, Thapelo Tseole, as well as economist and founder of eConsult, Dr. Keith Jeffries, to contribute to the discussion this evening. Mr. Tseole says he's convinced there is need to be concerned about this growing culture of overspending and increasing over-indebtedness.
I would say the culture of over-indebtedness is actually increasing at a very higher rate in Botswana than in the previous years.
Could you substantiate? Could you show us any current trends and what their implications are?
If you look at the statistics, as at January this year, the total household debt, which is basically your families and individuals, stood at about almost 24 billion pula. And if you look at that figure as a percentage of GDP, it's close to about 20% of GDP. And in previous years, it was far less. I remember about 3 or 4 years ago, it was about 12% of GDP. And therefore, if we are able to reach that rate at this time, you realize that they need to get worried about the indebtedness levels. And also, if you look at statistics over the previous years, you realize that households are actually now getting more loans than businesses, actually in the past 3 years. And this is a worry because households don't actually involve much in the productive activities, unlike businesses. Business actually get money to borrow. And also, even if you take the segment of household borrowing, you look at property, you look at credit cards, you look at personal loans, all of us we are showing an increase in indebtedness of the households.
Botswana consumers find themselves increasingly over-indebted, yet they continue to spend money. Where would you say this money is coming from?
Well, if they are really spending more than they're earning, then it must be coming from some kind of borrowing. But I should say that while we have this impression that there's over-indebtedness, the data on it is not very good. So it's more impressionistic than based on actual firm data.
In your more knowledgeable view then, what are you inclined to believe about the situation?
Well, I think that many households are certainly over-indebted. You know, when one hears of how many deductions people have from their salaries before they get their take-home pay, clearly a lot of it's going to repaying loans or paying interest. And certainly there seems to be a predominant attitude that people look for as much credit as they can get, whether they start with the banks and they go to the micro-lenders and they go to wherever else they can get credit. So I think that certainly impressionistically there's a lot of borrowing going on, and that's often being used to finance expenditure which is in excess of people's incomes, which is obviously raises problems for sustainability in the long term. You can't keep spending more than your income forever.
If we continue at this rate, what are the possible economic implications going forward?
You'll generally have an economy where a lot of people have actually been squeezed up in terms of their disposable income. People won't have money to spend on their daily needs. People will be highly indebted to some extent that should they encounter problems in terms of their present employment situation, they won't be able to support themselves. And even worse still, I mean, it have got a lot of implication in terms of retirement. If people are highly indebted, it can also imply that their savings level are very low. Their retirement levels are very low if you don't take the forced retirement at the workplace. And therefore, ultimately, at the end of the day, if everybody's over-indebtedness, will end up in trouble.
Well, I mean, in the short term, there are some economic benefits because it means that money gets spent in the shops, and the shopkeepers like it. It means they have more business, more turnover, more profit. But from a sort of broader and more long-term economic point of view, it's not very good because obviously it means that the burden of debt taken on by households is continually rising. And at some point we have problems starting at the level of individual households that they can't pay their debt, they can't service the debt, they might start defaulting. And that obviously has problems for both the borrower and the lender, because the lender doesn't get their money back. So that can cause problems in the financial system if too many households borrow and then don't pay back. The other problem is that from a macroeconomic point of view, it means that the balance of spending is very much focused on consumption items and not focused on investment items which build up the capital stock of the economy. And in addition, it means that a lot of the items that are financed through borrowing, the consumer spending items that are financed through borrowing, are imported, so that adds to the import bill, rather than borrowing that increases the productive capacity of the economy to be competitive and to increase exports, which is what we need in the long term.
We are yet to talk to commercial banks, but would you say there's an element of reckless lending fueling people spending more than they earn?
That's difficult to say. I mean, I think that banks do like lending to households, to retail customers, because it's quite a profitable form of lending, at least as long as the money comes back. the interest rates are quite high, so the margins are high, and banks can generally charge more on short-term unsecured personal loans to households than they can charge on, say, lending to businesses. So it's very profitable business for them, as long as the loans get paid back. Obviously, if they make losses, then it's no longer profitable. But I think the banks actually make an effort to see how much you can afford. So in terms of your income, the banks will always look at the borrower's income, what the deductions are, how much they can afford.
There are a lot of banks that I think we must admit. And also, I think there's also competition among the financial institutions to offer loans, because that is how they make money. They make money out of borrowing, out of giving people loans. And therefore, the more loans they give, the more money they get.
I don't think the banks are really the problem. The problem is when people then go to other lenders, the micro lenders or stores for store credit, who don't check. And I think that's where the irresponsible lending is. And of course, that lending is also much more expensive. The interest rates are much higher. So I think the irresponsible lending is actually being done by the non-bank lenders, who will pretty much lend regardless of whether the borrower can repay.
In just 1 year, household debt in Botswana has increased by 24% to over 23 billion pula. We sit down with the experts as promised to get a better idea of how big a problem this culture of debt really is, and to get an understanding of the mentality that some observers say is of people recklessly spending money they simply do not have. What is fueling the spending of money Botswana consumers simply do not have? What is the mentality behind this presumably new pattern of spending?
Oh, well, I think there's lots of things. I think one is that we somehow seem to, I don't know, we want new stuff. So if you look at cars, people ideally will like to buy a new car, and then after 2 or 3 years, they'll trade it in and get another new car. Whereas, to be honest, that car is probably good for 10 years. Many people seem to want a car that is basically newer and more expensive than is really justified by their income levels. Now, I don't know whether it's a status thing or what it is, but when you look at other countries, people are far more prepared to drive older, less impressive vehicles. So we get excited by these new flashy things. I don't know why that is, but that seems to be what happens here. And also, I think another factor is that there's a lot of aspirational spending. So people aspire to living standards, standards of consumption that are in excess of their incomes. And I think that's partly because this is quite an unequal society. And you may not earn very much, but you see people who earn a lot more than you do, consuming a lot more than you do, and you aspire to get there, and maybe don't think long term about whether what you're doing is sustainable if you're financing that consumption by borrowing. So I think that the fact that there is a lot of inequality in income levels and living standards does add to that the aspirational spending.
And also, I think there's need for improved information in terms of people who get themselves into debt. Because a lot of people, because of absence of enough information flow within the financial system, they'll go to a bank to get a loan, and then from a bank they'll go to another financing institution to get a loan, and then from there they'll also go to bomachonis, as we call them in Setswana, to get a loan. So you realize that people are actually getting multiple loans from multiple institutions, simply because these people can actually, or these institutions can actually share information about individuals. So this is how individuals end up getting over-indebtedness.
So it's more a case of availability of these loans, not something in our culture has changed in which people are living beyond their means, or...
We have a lot of people who are living beyond their means, because, it doesn't really make much of a a good sense, if I may say, for the household credit to be increasing at the rate at which it's increasing. You look at household property debt, it has gone up by close to 40%. You look at credit cards in the past year, they have gone up by almost 9%. You look at personal loans, they have gone up by almost 15%. But you look at the general performance of the economy, it hasn't gone up by all these percentages. It has also risen over about 5% and something. And in economics, you know that when the economy improves, it means the income levels of people is actually increasing. So when the economy is not actually performing that good, and then you have the credit growth at this extent, you see there's a mismatch in terms of growth rates of the economy and the credit growth. And this is where I think we have to guard against and try as much as possible to put in place measures, not necessarily in terms of legislation, but measures in place to actually address this issue.
Measures such as what?
Measures such as the systems that can be put in place for banks to appraise loans to give to individuals. Number one, a lot of education is also a very good thing that can actually be increased. But I think other countries also have even gone a step further to enact some laws or some regulations that actually regulate the credit market, because this is a market that they don't have to carelessly issue credit to individuals, because ultimately in the long run, I think the general economy can suffer.
Who do you think is really perpetuating this over-indebtedness?
I'll take a guess that it is mainly the younger generation. I mean, we know the older generation is very sort of conservative when it comes to a lot of things. But the younger generation, because of the peer pressures of living in the moment, of impressing friends, of trying to show off, I think that's where we have a real problem, that the younger generation become over-indebtedness. For the older generation, I think a lot of them are very conservative.
Countries such as Malaysia see a corresponding increase in household debt as their GDP and household income grows, which has not been the case in Botswana. We are to be compared with countries like Thailand, whose central bank has issued a statement warning that as the nation's economy is growing slower than household debt levels, it will ultimately be detrimental to the Thai economy. This is not to say that all debt is detrimental. Economists teach that there is what is considered good debt. Dr. Jeffries tells us how to discern between good and bad debt.
From an economic point of view, the good debt is debt that's used to finance investment, so to acquire assets. And obviously, property, your house. For most people, their house is their biggest single asset. Obviously things can go wrong in housing finance. We've seen that in other countries. But in general, it's established that borrowing, because the cost of housing is so high, not just in Botswana, but wherever you are, houses are expensive relative to income. You need to borrow to finance a house. You can't save for your whole life and then you buy a house when you're 70. So you need to borrow to buy a house, and people need houses. Obviously that's borrowing to finance the expansion of the asset base of the economy. Now, to some extent, there are other assets that can be productively financed by borrowing. So, for instance, if people are running small businesses, or people borrow to buy cattle or something like that, I mean, that's essentially investment. Now, the other type of debt, which I would, let's call it bad, less questionable, is when people borrow to finance consumption. That's not always bad. I mean, people, incomes vary. Your income may be higher in one year than another year, or it may vary through the year depending on your source of income, and sometimes you need to borrow to smooth out fluctuations in income. So it's not always bad borrowing for consumption purposes. Or you may borrow 1 year in the knowledge that next year you're going to get a pay rise and you'll be able to repay the debt. So you're just sort of advancing your consumption. The problem is when over a long period of time you're borrowing to finance consumption spending which is consistently higher than your income. So that means that it's not like you're borrowing to smooth out fluctuations in income, so you would borrow 1 year and repay the next year. If your borrowing is consistently high, your spending is consistently higher than your income, then your debt just goes up and up and up, and that that can't go on forever. So I think debt which is primarily based on financing consumption spending, which is consistently higher than income, is a problem because it's not sustainable. But borrowing that's largely for investment, I mean, you could even say borrowing for school fees, that's a form of investment, that's to finance investment in your kids. So that would probably fall into the better category. But really when it's to finance a consumption lifestyle that's more than you can really afford on the basis of your income, then it's a problem.
A very good evening to you all. Let's have a look at last week's capital market statistics. We start with the DCI, which was up by a marginal 0.01%, whilst the FCI, Foreign Companies Index, was stagnant for the week. Total turnover for the week was 8.7 million pula, a daily average of 2.2 million pula, and the total number of shares traded was 1.2 million. For year-to-date comparison, the DCI is down 0.67% compared to a 14.2% increase at this point last year, whilst the Foreign Companies Index is up 0.15% compared to a decline of 0.94% at this point last year. Total turnover for 2014 is 695.7 million compared to 359.1 million last year, and the total number of shares traded this year 186.4 million compared to 145.9 million last year. If we look at our ETFs, the Better Beta ETF lost 75 tebe to end the week at 41 pula 25 tebe, and the New Gold ETF was stagnant for the week and it closed at 108 pula 90 tebe. That was your stock market roundup. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Although thorough self-examination and self-education with regards to consumers' individual spending is called for, in light of all that has been shared tonight, fingers may also be pointing to reckless lending. As we further unpack this issue, we will next speak to members of the banking sector to hear how responsible their policies are in this regard and what they look at before lending consumers money. Tune in as we continue this conversation on the next episode of First Issues. Until next Tuesday, from me, Nameto Sibina, the team behind First Issues, and our sponsors, First National Bank, we wish you a good night and pleasant viewing.